Okay, great. Well, great to see everybody. If you've just arrived, if you can just make sure you're on mute, and feel free to keep your cameras on. Nice to see everyone here. So it's a real pleasure today to introduce Diana Omigie, who's a cognitive neuroscientist and member of the Music, Mind and Brain Research Group at Goldsmiths, so just around the corner from here where we are at UCL. And she co-directs the MSc program in Music, Mind and Brain there as well. And so I've just found out that these pictures on her opening slide are effectively Diana's bio. So she did her undergraduate at UCL in neuroscience, then went on to do a PhD on the cognitive and neural basis of congenital amusia at Goldsmiths. Then she did postdocs in France and in Frankfurt at the Max Planck Institute, where she still holds a position there, before returning to Goldsmiths as faculty to start her research group on music and neuroscience. And as you'll see, her research interests revolve around the behavioral, physiological and neural correlates of music-induced emotions and the aesthetic experience. And so I think, as some of you will have already seen from the abstract that Diana sent around, her research is at the intersection of lots of things that we've discussed before in this group. So things like information seeking and conscious awareness, but we haven't yet had a talk. We were just talking about before how we've been quite vision dominated, I think, in Consciousness Club, and that's probably social for various reasons that we can discuss, but we haven't yet had a talk that's connected us to one of the most amazing aspects of being human, which is music. So we're really looking forward to it, Diana, and over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I've already said thank you, but I have to thank you again in front of everyone, and thank everyone for taking time out to hear me speak today. I'm sure everyone's very busy, so it's an honor, and I'm really looking forward to the generous time we have for discussion. Hope you won't hold back and share your thoughts and comments. Yeah, I should say as well that when I was trying to decide, or trying to see who would have me as a PhD student, I was looking around, and of course, consciousness research, metacognition research seemed really exciting at the time. The big questions, of course, have their allure. And so I'm happy that even though I fell into music cognition research, that hasn't precluded us engaging and sort of sharing our research. Yeah, so here's my title, Why We Listen, the Value of Information in Music. Yesterday, when I looked at this title, again, let's see, why is this not progressing? I realized I might have to start with a disclaimer, because the question, why do we listen, is of course, you could answer, well, because music is always on everywhere we go. We go into the supermarkets, get some groceries, it's on. We're in the waiting room for the dentist, it's on. You go home, your flatmates or your partner's playing it, whether you like it or not. And even when we decide to turn it on ourselves, there's a huge range of reasons why we might choose to do so. Adolescents, for instance, are famously using music to sort of forge a sense of identity and maintain that sense of identity and share it with others. We use it as a social lubricant. We turn on music whenever there's a bunch of people around and we want everyone to feel at ease and somehow get in the mood, whatever that mood is meant to be. And we're constantly using it to modulate our affective states, and I should say our arousal states. We may try to use it to fall asleep or to energize before we go for a run. So there's no doubt there's a number of different reasons why we might choose to listen. However, as the second part of my talk suggests, I'm interested in sort of music from an information processing perspective, and trying to understand why we choose to listen. And the question about why we listen is really around why we choose to listen, have our attention captured and held by this temporary unfolding source of information, why this type of information can actually even trigger information seeking states. So, I mean, music information seeking, is that a bit of a leap? An example, I'd like to sort of describe it a scenario where arguably music is triggering a sort of information seeking state. So imagine you're in a cafe, you are maybe working on your laptop, or you're chatting to a friend, whatever you tend to do in cafes. However, all of a sudden you notice that the music's grabbed your attention and you're sort of cocking your ear to the speaker and trying to drown out ambient noise so you can hear this music better. Suddenly you can't focus on your work or what your friend is saying. And compared to 10 seconds ago, when you barely realized music was playing, now you actually would be quite cross if someone turned it off, maybe a bit annoyed and disappointed. I like to think of this as a good example of a situation where without meaning to, we suddenly devote attentional resources to music and arguably enter into this sort of information seeking state that we see in other situations as well. So information seeking, as you know, and it sounds like you all know, can simply be defined as the ways in which animals or any agents really seek and explore information in their environment. And generally the idea is someone, something, a child, a robot encounters novelty or complexity in the environment, perhaps has their expectations violated by something that's just happened. And this leads them to want to better understand the source of this new information, to reduce this uncertainty that's arisen. And this inevitably means that they have entered into a curious state, a curiosity state, a state of curiosity, a desire to reduce this uncertainty, and they actually start carrying out behaviors that will help them reduce this uncertainty, so-called exploratory behaviors, which simply put could be, I don't know, looking over a fence or picking up a dictionary and finding the meaning of a word. Could be anything really, but all of that should lead to should lead to learning of some sort, with devoting resources, for kind of going to internalize some information, and in many situations should lead to reward. Why? Because when we improve our model of the world, when we learn, this should be rewarded because it's arguably adaptive and going to help us survive in an environment that's constantly changing. Most of you will know, of course, that as a result, information-seeking states, behaviors are heavily associated with limbic, dopaminergic, and noradrenergic systems of the brain. In this review from Sakako et al., they point out how the midbrain dopaminergic areas are very much active when we encounter novel information. People who are high in novelty seeking tend to see greater activity in these areas when they encounter novelty. When we have ambiguity somehow resolved, this tends to be associated with activity in the striatum, sort of pleasure, seemingly a reward from sort of disambiguating the information that was causing uncertainty or novelty. And it's been shown that locus coeruleus, which projects to the anterior cingulate cortex and other prefrontal areas, again, very associated with tracking novelty and uncertainty in the environment. Really cementing the fact that this can drive learning is this, I think, a review from Gruber and Braganath, where they are emphasizing the role that the anterior cingulate cortex, for example, plays in helping to appraise the information gap that may have occurred when we encounter novelty or complexity, which combined with hippocampus, also able to sort of track entropy in a context, all of this leading to sort of curious states and ultimately enhanced learning through, again, the areas we expect would do that. So much for sort of what we have to thank for sort of driving these information seeking states and behaviors. Why should we care about it? I'm sure you all agree that that's an obvious question, obvious answer. It's the cornerstone of intelligent behavior. Information seeking is how we acquire knowledge in the world and how we're able to make good decisions when we need to. And of course, it's been shown to be, at a state of trait level, really important for a range of life outcomes. So we need, in the early stages of cognitive development, sort of searching, seeking, knowing where to devote resources to learn, all very important processes we need to be engaged in. Obviously, curiosity is important in our work, academic and school and work lives. We need a healthy dose of interest in others or curiosity to form and maintain interpersonal relationships. And it's been shown that those people who are high in trait curiosity, who actually express and experience curiosity often and in their older age, show better health outcomes. But then why would we use an aesthetic object like music to try to study something like information seeking? I've given you an example of a scenario that I would like to suggest is an example of us entering into an information seeking state, thanks to music but I would argue there's a very rich theoretical background for why we might want to do this. Theoretical and now empirical background or body of evidence for why we might want to use an aesthetic object like music. And this is just basically since Berline, and I'll show you before, the role of curiosity and interest have been really emphasized in our engagement with artworks. They're very important elements of the aesthetic response and how art keeps us looking, keeps us listening, and allows us to sort of see the world in a different way, I suppose. And I would argue that we can, music comes particularly highly recommended because thanks to computer scientists and part, musicians, part composers, and everyone who sort of thought this might be the way to go. We now have a number of tools that we can use to model information flow in music, and where, of course, we can model information flow, we can hopefully start tracking where in the brain or what aspects of behavior are also sensitive to this flow of information. So having sort of set out, some rationale for why music, why information seeking, why them both, I'd like to present the rest of my talk in 3 parts. So in the first part, I guess I'll be trying to provide more evidence that musical stimuli does, the information in music does seem to be tracked in the same way that you'll see information in other contexts being tracked, and therefore, music perhaps lends itself to being looked at from this sort of information processing, information seeking perspective. I'd then like to present newer data where, lots fresh off the press, so to speak, and lots kind of early days research, where we're trying to look at the extent to which it's relevant to talk about music-induced curiosity, the extent to which self-report of experiences of curiosity seem to be explainable by the information dynamics of music and other factors that one would expect might be contributing to any sorts of feelings of curiosity during music listening. And in the third part, I'd just like to reflect a little bit. Like I said, early stages, lots of input, always welcome, and really just discuss the whole idea of that I'm putting forward today, and see, where there's room for thinking deeper. So starting with this notion of music-induced surprise and uncertainty, I think the important thing to start with is this idea, that's very much accepted in music psychology, cognition, that we acquire knowledge of music's regularities simply based on a lifetime of listening. So even though most of us would have learned a bit of music at school, a bit of music at home, some of us may have gone to conservatories and become professional musicians, none of that is as important as just our constant exposure to musical stimuli wherever we go. So there's some benefit to having music on all the time. So this lifetime of listening allows us to learn music's regularities through statistical learning, just basically internalizing the probabilities with which events co-occur. It's how we know, that this note should not occur in this melody. This melody is in this key. It's very unlikely that this note outside of the diatonic scale would occur unless it was a mistake or a very unusual, I don't know, if it was a simple melody, it's probably just a mistake. But suffice it to say, we learn about events and how they tend to co-occur just through listening, and this affords us the capacity for so-called musical expectancy, an ability to constantly be anticipating how a piece of music will unfold. And of course, if we're constantly making predictions, sometimes we might get them wrong, and in these situations, we are experiencing what we say call in the field music-induced surprise. But other times we might find it difficult to make predictions in the first place, and I'll tell you why in a second. But in these occasions, we experience music-induced uncertainty. But how can we quantify these? And I guess the simplest way, and still seemingly quite powerful way is using so-called n-gram models, which of course just acquire knowledge by extracting statistical regularities. So you can extract unigrams in the sequence, for instance, to use a sort of example from just language. In the sequence, you can extract so-called unigrams, single words, or you can extract bigrams, or you can extract trigrams. But either way, an n-gram model will extract these grams and learn from them the probability distributions and try to predict and try to estimate the probabilities with which other events can occur based on how often they've occurred following other said events in the past. Importantly, this sort of technique has been used since the 50s as tools for composition and improvisation, for music information retrieval, by which I mean a whole field that tries to extract information from music and, for different purposes, tools to aid composition, tools that we can use in everyday life, tools that we can use in research. And yeah, has been used for a very long time as well now in modeling music perception. And n-gram models have been shown to be particularly powerful when we combine them with so-called multiple viewpoint systems, which basically means that instead of just extracting probability distributions for single features, we're extracting it for several different features. Single features, we extract them for several different features and combine those estimates to try to predict X event. And so, for example, here you see, chromatic pitch, mode, metrical level, onset interval, duration, all being sort of entered into a model and probability distributions being built on those features before all being combined to provide an output. And one example of a model that does, just that, uses a sort of statistical learning paradigm and multiple viewpoint system is the information dynamics of music model from a colleague's Marcus Pierce, who was at City when he did this in his PhD, started developing this program in his model in his PhD, but continued that work in the computing department at Goldsmiths, where there's quite a few people sort of doing this kind of work. This model basically, in its most common configuration, will include a so-called long-term model and a short-term model. And what the long-term model will try to do is, it will learn from a corpus of music that you've provided it with. And if you were trying to, for example, estimate parameters for very simple melodies, you might give it, Western tonal melodies, you might give it a bunch of folk songs from, European countries, etc. But anyway, it learns the regularities in the corpus of music that you give it from a specific style that you're interested in, but it also tends to have a short-term component that learns from the melody itself as it unfolds, because of course there'll be idiosyncrasies or nuances to that melody that you want to, pay attention to. But suffice it to say, across the different viewpoints, it's able to spit out, very briefly, a couple of parameters that might be of interest. Information content, which is the negative log of the probability of an event occurring, and therefore the surprise value of that event, and entropy, which is sort of information theoretic concept from Shannon. The more possible outcomes, the more they are similar in likelihood, the higher the entropy of, of a context or a moment. And in this case, the entropy output of this model is basically giving you a readout of the uncertainty that an enculturated, ideal observer should be experiencing when they, just before they encounter an incoming musical event. Importantly, after a couple of decades of it being around, these measures or these outputs have been validated by a few studies now. IC does really correlate really well with subjective reports of unexpectedness during music listening, and entropy has been shown to correlate with sort of behavioral measures of uncertainty, how unsure people are as to what's going to happen next. And
sorry, it's Benedetto De Martino here. Sorry to interrupt you, but I have a very quick question, just to understand. I'm understanding clearly at what level we are talking here about uncertainty and surprise, because it's clearly that you're not, people love to listen familiar music. Mm-hmm. I seems to understand from you that when you're talking about surprise and uncertainty, you are talking about the micro level into the unfolding of the piece of music. But even there, I would like to understand then why a completely random, sequence of notes that will have a maximum uncertainty. And that is definitely not what we are looking for, mostly pleasurable. If you can slightly clarify at what level we're talking about uncertainty here.
Okay.
And I think I have an idea, but I'm not sure I don't know much about the things, and I might be wrong. Yeah.
I hope it'll become clearer as I continue to sort of unfold some, paradigms, data, etc. But it is a very micro level in this example, and actually in the first couple of studies. Well, not example so much as, in the first couple of studies, I'll show how we're modeling the information content and the uncertainty or the entropy of associated with notes, single notes in, for example, a very simple melody. So you could, of course, find the mean information content across a whole melody and say something about how surprising, on average it is, or how uncertain it should make a listener, how entropic it is. But you can also do that on a note by note level. And it's interesting because I'll discuss later whether or not it's relevant to discuss curiosity, for example, with regards to music. Some might argue, to what extent should we be talking about surprise? I mean, it's something we don't necessarily think every time we hear a note, oh, less surprise, more surprise, less surprise. But it's just something that we're literally taking a model, trying to output some variables based on what has been learned from the structure of music and what we should therefore be experiencing. And we're trying to see the extent to which, like I said, it's sort of
and just to understand, and then you are equating surprise with the pleasure, with the reason why you like it. So your implicit link is most surprised the best.
We'll
Less
see.
Surprise.
Second. I'm glad you.
Okay. I'll wait. Yeah, sorry.
Reward is just around the corner.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So just continuing with sort of the idea of surprise in the first instance, where is music induced surprise and using scalp EEG. I'm sorry, I should say basically actually. So where in the past, and this isn't that, distance of past, but where early in sort of music cognition research, we would sort of construct or compose short musical fragments, and we might put, like in this case, a chord progression, and then we take the top line to get the melody. Where in the past we might compose these short fragments of music and maybe introduce a highly unexpected event in order to see the extent to which irregularity or unexpectedness in music is being tracked by our favorite, electrophysical signatures. Nowadays, what we tend to do is say, well, let's use a model like idiom, and let's track the information content or the surprise of all the events in the piece of music that we've given it. And, in the study, for instance, we're able to show that if you sort of just bin all the notes by the information content, you see this nice tracking of information content by the, in this case, the sort of an early right anterior negativity. And so I should say this is a melody, an example melody in this experiment. Thanks to the model, you can sort of spit out a so-called information content profile where lower information content is sort of less surprising events, higher information content, more surprising events. You can sort of pick and choose the ones you want, or you can, like I said, just sort of use them all and see how information tracking is how our brains are tracking not just artificially inserted events, but, events on a note by note level. Of course, it's nice to show these sort of earlier right anterior negativities, but we want to see sometimes if there's more going on. For instance, we might care about sort of medial subcortical areas that are associated with conflict or arousal. And wouldn't it be nice, given how much we know about music's ability to move us, to cause sort of arousal, to show that deeper areas of the brain are also tracking information content. So it was in France actually that I began to collect some intracranial EEG data, stereoencephalography, which of course means that the electrodes go deep, and we can collect data from amygdala, anterior cingulate cortex, insula, for example, amongst others. And in this study, we just had participants, I should say actually, I said the last study was just having people listen to simple melodies. Here's an example. I'm sorry, this doesn't match the melody, doesn't match the notation. I realize I may not have shared audio, or did you hear that?
We heard a little bit, or I did at least.
All right, so if it's really bad, we can go through the ropes, the routine. But for now,
Diana, the volume's not supposed to be fluctuating wildly. Is that correct?
not really. No. Should
Okay.
we?
I think maybe we're picking it up through your microphone.
Yeah, that's what's happening. So yeah, it might be terrible quality. Should we just continue? There's a few other music excerpts. If they're really bad, we'll just interrupt. And
I think there's also, in Zoom, isn't there just an option to click and say, share your computer audio?
let's do that now. Okay, 1 second. Share screen. Who remembers where it is?
I think it's part of the share screen settings. I think
Okay,
it's like a checkbox somewhere.
Okay, yeah, I think I just need to share again and then it'll give me, yeah, there we go. Share sound, that should be better. Okay, so I'll just play this really boring melody again. Promise to play you get to know. So the idea is you can present just, in this case, 50 simple melodies to your patients who are implanted with intracranial EEG for clinical reasons. I'm sure all of you know that this is because they need to undergo resection because they have epilepsy that can't be managed by drugs. But either way, in the 2-week period, they're being sort of monitored. We asked them to take part in our experiments, and in this case we just play them some very simple melodies, and we were interested in the extent to which some, like I said, sort of subcortical areas are tracking information content in music. And just to give you an idea of what we were doing, we're just taking all the notes and all the melodies that they're presented, sorting them by information content, splitting those into bins of increasing information content, estimating sort of oscillatory power for each of these bins for areas of interest, and then looking at the extent to which we're seeing a parametric modulation of this activity in these areas of interest. And it's kind of a busy slide, which is why I'm just going to hide some bits for a bit. Some of the areas of interest, of course, are these lateral cortical areas where we expect to see tracking of, sequence, just structure of a sequence. So some superior temporal gyrus, left and right middle temporal gyrus, the IFG, and these are the frequency bands I guess we were exploring. And what you'll see in a second is some time courses. So X will be a time courses of how oscillatory activity looks for bins of increasing information content. The lowest 3 will be in blue, the middle in green, and the highest in red. There'll be 10 lines, but 3 colors seem like plenty. But what you see is this gray shaded shows kind of where you're seeing this sort of parametric modulation of information content, parametric modulation of activity by information content. And here, for instance, the blue, green, red is just showing that as information content increases, you're seeing this increase in activity in these areas, superior temporal gyrus and right middle temporal gyrus. Not IFG, which was a little bit, this didn't seem to reach significance. We argue perhaps because compared to chord progressions where we tend to see this sort of activity, syntax processing, melodies don't have quite as many rules that they need to follow for them to be seen as syntactically correct. But suffice it to say, the sort of obvious areas are being shown to track information content, but more interestingly, those areas that we don't necessarily know for sure we're measuring from when we use scalp EEG, also sort of tracking information content, the anterior cingulate gyrus and the insula. And I guess just moving on so I don't lose too much time, the next steps were to say, well, there's more to music than just sort of surprising events in a melody. I mean, some of these can be modeled, to be fair, by the model that I've just described, but we have chromaticism, which basically just means that instead of following a very clear key, using the diatonic scale, the 7 notes that you should be using if you're playing in a specific key, sometimes music will be interspersed with all the notes of all the possible notes. This is what adds interest, will help composers sort of get us feeling a bit uncertain about what's going to happen. Music has key changes, metrical changes, and we were wondering, well, if all of these sources of complexity should be leading to uncertainty in listeners, can we track that in slightly richer, more naturalistic stimuli than the types I've just presented? So I described a model idiom where we were tracking information, where we were trying to model information content and entropy, and therefore surprise and uncertainty. That works on sort of symbolic data. So you basically give it a melody and you say, well, the notes are 60, 65, 62, 63, and that's just MIDI data. It's like that pitch, that pitch, that pitch, that pitch. You may give it information about note durations. You may give it information about onset intervals, but it's all sort of very symbolic information. And sometimes that can be very rich, or we can transpose really rich musical data. If you have a MIDI piano, you can transfer that back into sort of very rich symbolic information. But often we just hear music played by a, an orchestra, by a, rock and roll band, and that isn't going to be as easy to sort of model in a symbolic way. What we can do, however, is take the audio file and extract some features that we know to be associated with uncertainty, surprise, etc. And so the MIRL toolbox, developed by Finnish colleagues, tries to do just that. You give it an audio signal waveform. It will break down the spectrum, build a so-called chromogram where it's extracting the pitch profiles, the pitches. You sort of apply it over sliding time windows over a piece of music, and you can extract the pitches there, try to infer what the key might be, what the strength with which that key is being represented is, and so on and so forth. You might also try to extract the extent to which a pulse is very clearly represented. You'll do this by getting the envelope, autocorrelating it to infer first of all the tempo, and then decide the extent to which it's actually autocorrelating and therefore having a very clear pulse or not. And so, for instance, like I've just pointed out, key clarity, which has been shown to be negatively associated with feelings of uncertainty. So the more, less clear a key is, the more uncertain you tend to feel, is basically a reflection of the degree of the absence of chromaticism, which basically means the degree to which only diatonic scales are being used and there's no modulation. And the degree, and there's basically inferred by looking at the extent to which the extracted pitch profiles are fitting to normative key profiles, what we expect to see in a certain key. And pulse clarity, like I've just pointed out, is the clarity of the perceived pulse in a given piece of music, and it's based on this autocorrelation function of extracted tone onsets. The important thing is, like I said, a lower key clarity, a lower pulse clarity should tend to lead to, has tended to show to lead to greater uncertainty in listeners, because if you don't know exactly what the key is, you're unlikely to know what the next event is, musical event is likely to be. If you're not quite sure about what the pulse is at this moment, you're not going to know when the next event is going to happen. So like I said, we were keen to sort of move into sort of richer musical stimuli. At the time I was in Frankfurt, so you have to forgive the people I was working with particularly loved Western classical music, so we had some lovely examples of that. And so on and so forth. They're quite different piece from Mendelssohn, piano this time. Okay, and yeah, the idea being you can basically at this point just play anything, and the important thing is that you can extract music features with this with the functions and these toolboxes that allow you to extract key strength, extract pulse clarity. In this case, you can play it to participants who are implanted with stereo EEG, like I said, for clinical reasons. The EEG is being recorded anyway, so you just ask for the couple of hours where you were with them, or hour where you were with them. And you then are able to sort of take those musical features you've extracted and see the extent to which they're being tracked by the signatures, EEG signatures you think they might be tracked by. So in this case, sort of partial correlations, and I won't go into sort of, I've actually forgotten some of the details of that, but basically just seeing the extent to which different oscillatory bands are tracking the information in, tracking these features. And this is quite a busy slide, where we're looking at sound intensity just as a sort of proof of concept, and pulse clarity and key clarity as sort of more interesting features, higher level musical features, or you could say lower level, depending on who you are, and looking at the extent to which the more lateral areas that were of interest, so superior temporal, frontal temporal areas are tracking sound intensity, pulse clarity, key clarity. But just to zoom in for a bit, show you some of the time courses and some of the effects. Here you see that in the gamma band, posterior superior temporal gyrus contact, sort of nicely tracking, i.e. this EEG data is in the dotted line, nicely tracking the time course, the sound intensity, the waveform of the music. We expect high gamma power, we expect to sort of tracking neural firing, tracking the sort of intensity, the amplitude waveform has been shown in speech stimuli and so on and so forth. Alpha negatively correlating with, in the same area, same contact, negatively correlating with sound intensity. But also, like I said, in pulse, go ahead.
Quick question. Did alpha and gamma also negatively correlate with each other then?
Yeah. Again, that's been shown quite a few times in the sort of speech. And yeah, but I guess importantly for pulse clarity and key clarity, the areas that we tended to see tracking uncertainty or pulse clarity and key clarity, which we were using as a proxy for uncertainty, negatively correlated, were in fact negatively correlated. So sorry, parahippocampal gyrus, singular gyrus, these sorts of areas were negatively tracking pulse clarity and key clarity. We assume because if these are areas involved in sort of tracking uncertainty and entropy, then it would make sense that they're tracking the sort of any uncertainty that may ensue from the lack of a clear pulse, the lack of a clear tonal center. And just to say the sort of IFG, which is associated with syntax processing, and which in the music cognition we tend to just label it as such, was more positively tracked, tracking these things, which I guess kind of made sense as well. But just to recap, I guess the point of the first couple of studies were to show that those brain regions we tend to associate with conflict and arousal seem to be implicated in the processing of music-induced surprise and uncertainty. But in the next part of the talk, what I'd like to sort of, where I'd like to go is the fact that if surprise and uncertainty tends to be associated with the induction of curiosity in the listener, you know, if we believe this little schematic that I built, then an interesting next question is the extent to which any change self-report of curiosity, any reports of curiosity people are able to self-report can be explained during music listening, can be explained by some of these, can be explained by information dynamics of the music that's being heard. So towards an introduction, an exploration of music-induced curiosity, I guess it's important to define curiosity before we go any further. William James described it as the impulse towards better cognition, and others have described it as an internally driven information-seeking state. This to sort of differentiate it from information-seeking states that are extrinsically driven. So, you know, looking up at the traffic lights before you cross the road, so you get to the other side in one piece, or looking up the answers in your textbook if you're doing an open book exam, a student of the 2021s, and so on and so forth. It's been defined as the motivation or desire to seek and learn new information. And perhaps you've already sort of been discussing some of the papers, recent papers, or some not so recent anymore, that have tried to start studying curiosity in the lab after a period of relative, not being ignored, a period of this topic being ignored. Some of these studies, these approaches include using trivia questions. You'll present people with questions like who won the World Cup in 2004? How, what is the answer? how confident or uncertain are you as to who it was, how curious are you as to the answer, and so on and so forth. So these sorts of paradigms are trying to tap into sort of so-called epistemic curiosity, specific epistemic curiosity about specific piece of information. And this study, for instance, which put people in the scanner, showed that the chordates seem to be induced during the sort of induction phase of curiosity, though some people have argued there might be reasons why these regions were induced related to the design of the experiment. But suffice to say, some really nice work in the very early days showing, presenting us some paradigms that we can use to explore curiosity. Others have cared more about so-called specific perceptual curiosity. So what we're seeing, if it's been compromised, a blurry photo, if it's a moony image, this ambiguous visual input sometimes induces curiosity in a perceiver, and they're asked to say how curious they are, how certain they are as to what the object is, and so on and so forth. And this is an example of a study, for instance, that has really implicated the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula in this, period of not knowing, of wanting to know, arguably. And finally, we have other tasks that have tried to, for instance, separate out the role of outcome uncertainty from any sort of expected value that the outcome may have, and which have in those sort of more lottery tasks, which have in the recent, which have shown sort of implicated in frontal and parietal areas. Suffice to say, very active area of research. Always very nice to see the new work that comes in and sort of adds a little piece to the jigsaw puzzle. But most people would agree that curiosity, in whatever form it takes, whatever approach is taken to sort of study it, should be understood as this drive to reduce uncertainty. And some would argue that it's just a bucket of mechanisms that include a drive to reduce uncertainty that's conscious or unconscious. So you may, curious behavior could be just looking up quickly without even realizing, just to find out what the source of a noise is, or actually actively attending and continuing to attend so you can better understand what the source of the noise is. So what do we know about curiosity as a function of musical structure? The little we know is just a few studies, exploratory studies that we've been carrying out in the last year or so. In this study, we use a so-called countdown clock paradigm, where we're asking about actually subjective self-reports of curiosity while listening to music. So going really for the sort of conscious, aware curiosity states that are quite different to anything else that might be happening implicitly. Just to show you what that looks like, this countdown clock paradigm has people listen and attend to this clock, and it'll work its way in quarter intervals or in quarter circles to strike 12, and that's when participants have to say just how curious they are as to how the music will unfold. And we've used it in the past to sort of look at how to probe unexpected feelings of unexpectedness during music listening, and so on and so forth. So to give you a feeling, you have to use these buttons at the bottom to say how curious you feel about how the music will unfold when the clock strikes 12, and just to show what it looks like. If you're feeling sorry for our participants, this isn't the worst experiment we've done with them. Basically having them just sort of report on their experience in a way that they probably wouldn't ever think to do in everyday life, but that's how we get data. Of course, the important thing is we're extracting uncertainty or surprise, entropy and information content values from the melodies that we've presented them, specifically the probe melody, the probe notes, because those are the ones that they've provided some subjective report data to. And what you see in this diagram is how the reports of surprise looks as a function of the information content of the events and the entropy of the event. And by that, I mean the uncertainty that the listener should have been experiencing or feeling just before the note occurs, how uncertain or they should be about what that note is going to be, thanks to the fact that it could have been any number of notes because of what's come before. The sort of bright colors are higher curiosity. And I guess the first thing to do is just sort of show that the expected association between high note information content and curiosity was there. The sort of more surprising the event was, the sort of greater the uncertainty they reported, the curiosity they reported. This less the case when we go into sort of higher entropy contexts. Here, the association somewhat there, but not as clear. And in fact, you have moments where people are reporting greater curiosity for low information content nodes than higher information content nodes in these high entropy contexts. And arguably, this is, if we really wanted to sort of latch onto the curiosity literature, it's perhaps in line with the notion that when there is some sort of belief that there is learnable structure in the low entropy context, you're going to see curiosity linearly related to the sort of any uncertainty or surprise, uncertainty as a result of surprise that has just been experienced. But of course, it's also just in line with this idea of the predictive of model precision. So you will experience greater surprise, greater curiosity in lower entropy contexts. And this is something we'd already explored with pupil dilation responses, manipulating the entropy of a musical context and then introducing a deviant and showing that pupil dilation to deviants are much greater in low than high entropy musical context, which just kind of bodes well for using these kinds of measures in the future for also hopefully tracking curiosity with slightly cleverer paradigms. Again, my research always sort of starts with very simple musical stimuli, and then me wanting to try to say something about the actual sorts of music we listen to. Here we have, composition from the 1700s through to sort of 1900s, through to electronica piece, and this is from an Australian band, involves a didgeridoo. But you have pieces like this. And so on and so forth. It's quite chaotic, that piece, but either way, try to be, Boccherini is basically classical, but tried to be quite diverse in the sort of pieces shown. And here the question, the task, equally difficult, I guess, or maybe even more difficult than the last one, was just for people to rate how curious they were as to how the music would continue as it unfolded. So they just had to sort of, to the best of their ability, follow their intuitions and just say, yeah, care a bit more about what's going on now. Would like to keep hearing it. Would like to know it more, and not really that bothered. So had them do that. And here, what we're interested in, however, is the extent to which the experience of change in the music may actually be driving the experience of curiosity. So that is a task actually that has been used a few times and has been related to sort of valence and what have you, and also sort of how we segment music and how, what's going on when we hear a longer piece. But in this case, we were interested in the extent to which people's experience of change may be driving experiences of curiosity. And so we had them do both of these tasks and use Granger causality to try to see the extent to which there was a predictive relationship between these time courses. And you'll know it's Granger causality is a statistical hypothesis test or analysis approach. Came from econometrics in the 60s from Granger, and you're basically trying to see the extent to which one time course or time series is able to forecast another. So the extent to which, for instance, Y is able to predict Y, X is able to predict Y better than Y on its own, just Y autocorrelating, for instance. And what you see here is the results of the study. On top, you have sort of the grand averages of the time courses, curiosity and change. And here, I guess, is the most interesting part, where you see just plotted the p-values of the significance of the tests, looking at the extent to which change is predicting curiosity and curiosity is predicting change. So red shows change, Granger causing curiosity preceding and influencing curiosity, and the black circles show the other way around, curiosity predicting change. And then the sort of small red circles are just, you know, a technique that sometimes we use just to mumble up the time series, because if they were showing, you know, patterns of causality, you might wonder whether everything is all a bit spurious. But the important thing is you mostly only see the red dots outside of this the shaded area, which is showing, you know, what falls outside of, you know, after you've corrected for the multiple comparisons. And it's mostly, and that just basically shows that change is stranger causing curiosity about 2 seconds after they've experienced, or 1 to 2 seconds after they've experienced, report experiencing change. They're also reporting curiosity. There was, however, one piece of music, from the Chemical Brothers, this electronica piece, where for, you know, 3 seconds before before a change occurs, they start reporting curiosity. We don't want to, you know, run away with this particular data point, but it does suggest that there is a case for thinking about the ways in which curiosity can be anticipatory. And of course, when we think about curiosity, we always think about what's the outcome looking forward. Just to say that, of course, so far I've talked about curiosity as reactive. You know, it's higher following a high information content event. It's, you know, higher following perceived change, but we know that curiosity seems to be driven by beliefs regarding the future outcome. You know, you want any opportunities to improve your world model should be driving curiosity, feelings of curiosity. It's been shown that actually positively valenced information, further, you know, in addition, may also, you know, the anticipation of receiving positive information also seems to be associated with curiosity. So in this next study, what we were trying to do is sort of look into the evidence for any sort of anticipatory forms of curiosity during music listening. And just with this master's student, we had them do another sort of continuous rating task. This time we used only Western classical music, but we used examples of tonal music, well, just from the sort of common era, 1600 to 1700, where it's a very clear tonal center, and then atonal music from the 20th century, where Schoenberg and Webern and Dale were doing away with sort of the idea of tonality and saying, let's just play people random pitches, do some other things to it, and hope they enjoy it. Either way, a very clear difference in the extent to which there's a tonal center in the music. And what we did was we had these people rate continuous ratings of curiosity while listening to these music excerpts, about 24 of them, and use Granger causality again to look at the relationship this time between curiosity and the clarity of the key in the stimulus. So a moment of high key, remember this is a feature that we can just extract for the whole piece of music, you know, 3 second moving time windows, because that's how much you need to extract pitches and so on and so forth. But you can have, as you know, match the time sampling rates and get these two time courses going and look at the relationships between them. And what we show in fact is that increase in this case, so compared to change, in this case, increases in curiosity were tied to future increases in key clarity. So here you see curiosity being being explained by key clarity, and here key clarity being explained by curiosity. And seemingly paradoxically, people are actually, their feelings of curiosity are preceding sort of increases in key clarity compared to the other way around. And what's more, we see this greater, causal relationship for the music with higher key clarity. So what does that mean? I think it suggests that it's not uncertainty alone per se that's driving curiosity. Isn't just a lack of clarity in the key alone. Otherwise, we would see, arguably a difference between these two in where we're looking at curiosity predicted by key clarity. Rather, it might have something to do with the anticipation of the resolution, getting that sort of, tonic, getting the resolution that you expect during moments of the conflict and the tension that you especially see in in tonal music. So again, even the high expectation that the uncertainty is going to be resolved seems to be reflected in the fact that it was the tonal excerpts, even more than the atonal excerpts, where you saw this link between the key curiosity and future increases in key clarity. And then finally, well, yeah, I guess mostly finally, sort of talking briefly about pleasure and reward, because of course, in the schematic that I showed you, the idea is, we start with music as information, new stuff is happening, we're being made to feel quite uncertain because there's lots of perhaps stochasticity also happening. We enter into curious states, we learn, and this should all be rewarding from an information seeking perspective. And certainly we know that music can be rewarding. So to what extent do these link up? And I said before that it's not only since the 50s that people have been linking information seeking or pleasure with information. It's probably even before Joseph Addison in his essay Pleasures of the Imagination. Nevertheless, he said everything that is new or uncommon raises a pleasure in the imagination because it fills the soul with an agreeable surprise, gratifies its curiosity, and gives it an idea of which it was not before possessed. It is this that improves what is great or beautiful. And it's important to note that around that time, people were talking about the great or the sublime and the beautiful as the important aesthetic values. He was suggesting novelty should be up there. It improved those things. It gave led to curiosity, led to surprise. Unfortunately, Edmund Burke would come later and to say, no, novelty is too commonplace. It shouldn't be considered an aesthetic value. And perhaps for that reason, we don't hear about novelty as much when we talk about music. We don't say, oh, well, we talk about it being original, etc., but we always talk about how beautiful it was or how sublime it was. But happily, researchers do care a lot about novelty and consequences and uncertainty and the surprise. And we have begun to ask, well, to what extent is pleasure informed or influenced by the information dynamics in music? In other words, can we account for music-induced pleasure with something like surprise uncertainty as estimated with idiom, for instance? So in this study, they use idiom, they train it on some pop songs from chord progressions from very popular pop songs in the Billboard charts, I think several hundred of them, and then presented participants with these chord progressions, each chord about 2.4 seconds, which isn't terribly stretched out, but enough that people can actually make ratings as they go along. And they were asked to rate the pleasantness of chords and pop song chord progressions as these real music chord progressions unfolded. And just to show you that, yeah, you'd have like a sort of chord progression here. This is the amplitude waveform, and you're able to extract uncertainty and you're able to extract surprise. And there are moments where, these are not correlated at all. Surprise is high, but uncertainty is low, and vice versa. And what they found was that, and here pleasure is, again, the sort of third dimension, it's the hot color. What we see is that at moments of low uncertainty, so when you're quite sure what's going to happen, you find it most pleasurable to get something surprising, something that you didn't expect. And on the other hand, if you weren't quite sure what was going to happen, you were quite uncertain, the thing that you found most likely to occur is what gives you the most pleasure. And if you were to try to understand why this, you could argue it's because, well, without sort of maybe previewing what I would like to talk about a little bit more, in both of these situations, these are moments where there's a potential to learn or to sort of, and therefore we think to be rewarded. When you think you know what's going on and suddenly something new happens, it suggests that you are in the right place. There is still something to learn. And similarly, when something seemed unpredictable, but suddenly you get something right, it suggests maybe it isn't, and maybe there is some value in sticking around. Either way, it definitely helped me better understand why, Meyer, one of the great music theorists, music psychology theorists, composer, sort of Renaissance man of music psychology, suggested that both violation and fulfillment of expectations can be experienced as pleasurable. We seem to be seeing that maybe it has to do with the musical context, whereby, like I said, surprise when you didn't think there was anything else to learn and is pleasurable, and vice versa, fulfillment when you thought it was unlearnable seems to be rewarding. Of course, one could ask, is this the same for everyone? I mean, it's nice to see some sort of explanation of how pleasure can be explained by information dynamics, but it's rarely the case that everyone behaves the same way. And in I think the last study I'll show you, we were interested in the extent to which people's trait curiosity can actually influence, trait curiosity profiles can actually influence how they enjoy music as a function of its information dynamics. And just to sort of define what I mean by trait curiosity, I guess I've been using curiosity in a very state way up till now. Trait curiosity is a tendency to experience state curiosity often in everyday life. So it's a measurable characteristic of a person, and it's been argued that it's highly multidimensional. So in the 5DC scale, well, not so recently anymore, but fairly recently published by Kashdan, the emphasis was on seeking the many different ways in which people can be vary in their curiosity. So he identifies 5 dimensions of particular relevance, and one of them is the valence of the curiosity experience. Now, there's a huge debate as to whether curiosity is appetitive or, you know, nice feeling or sort of aversive. Either way, the suggestion here is that this can vary for people. If you're high on the joyous exploration dimension, you will rate highly this statement: I enjoy learning about subjects that are unfamiliar to me. If, however, you are high on deprivation sensitivity, you might be fairly high on joyous exploration, but you are someone who won't rest until you've solved the problem, until you reduce that uncertainty. So you would rate this statement high. Thinking about solutions to difficult conceptual problems can keep me awake at night. He points out that it's also important to characterize the extent to which people are able or report being able to cope with new experiences and information, so stress tolerance, and also emphasizes the importance of specifying the types of information people might be interested in or drawn to. And I guess there's several different scales that had tried to look at these different aspects of dimension, aspects of curiosity with the individual scales. But the idea was to really look through the literature and see what the most important dimensions could be and try to put them in one scale. He goes as far as, and his colleagues go as far as suggesting you can then identify, you know, types of curious people. You could have the fascinated, who are high in joyous exploration. They love, you know, the unfamiliar and the uncertain. They can tolerate the stress that comes with that. They, you know, they seek out thrilling experiences. The problem solvers, on the other hand, relatively high in deprivation sensitivity, so they can't really rest until they know until they've solved the problem, and so on and so forth. The empathizers are sort of higher in social curiosity, and the avoiders, on the other hand, are low in most dimensions. They generally aren't moved much by stimuli that's new or uncertain, and they certainly don't necessarily enjoy it. One of my undergrad students was able to fairly degree sort of re-identify these clusters and show that, for instance, it explained the extent to which people were enjoying non-Western music that perhaps they weren't as familiar with. So there seems to be some explanatory power for this variable, but in this task that I'll show you, what we were interested in is the extent to which it might actually predict how people report enjoying music as a function of its information dynamics. So we went back to this calm down clock paradigm where we'd ask people to rate their curiosity after, you know, at specific moments. We asked them to do 2 tasks this time. We asked them to rate their curiosity, and we'd also ask them to rate how much they were enjoying the music at that moment when probed. And on this occasion, because they were very simple stimuli and to very similar melodies to what you heard, very simple, we didn't think there'd be much use in looking at empathizers, for instance, but we just looked at the ways in which people most differed, and we saw that it was in the degree to which they tolerate stress, and showed that even though these 2 groups didn't differ in the extent to which they found high information content events curiosity inducing, they did, however, differ in the extent to which they reported enjoying high information content events relative to low information content events, whereby the stress intolerant tended to prefer their expectations being fulfilled than violated, and the stress tolerant, you know, liked both equally. If anything, they were tending towards enjoying being surprised. And yeah, just to recap that, I guess, and the final sort of moments or slides. We've looked at the neural correlates of music-induced surprise and uncertainty. I tried to show they overlap with surprise and uncertainty in other domains. Tried to show that listeners report changing levels of state curiosity as a function of music's information dynamics. We looked at a few things, sort of the entropy, uncertainty, the change, the perception of change, and show that trait curiosity dimensions may actually explain a little bit the extent to which people experience reward as a function of music's information dynamics. Like I said, I wanted to just sort of spend a few moments talking a little bit about what all of this might mean and where and why any of this might be worth doing if it is. And that's what I'll do with the next in the next slides.
And just to say, so we're at 10 past 12 now. I just want to make sure you've got enough time for questions.
Sure. Okay, that's amazing. Okay, I thought I would be done in 40 minutes. Anyway, so I'll round up in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Less. So I guess one question, maybe I'll preempt it, is do we need to invoke this concept of music-induced curiosity? And it's one I've asked myself, which is why I think it's kind of a nice one to just put out there, and hopefully we can discuss. I would say it depends. I mean, we can do a lot with surprise, and even that, I suppose, was arguable. Do we need to invoke the idea of musical-induced surprise? But either way, that seems to be useful. And I would argue this notion of curiosity can be useful in the context of music. If we want to explain fluctuations in the intentions of music, why listeners might focus on different things, on repeated hearings. It's a stimuli where information and pleasure seems to be very strongly linked, and it'd be nice to sort of take advantage of that. I would argue if we agree that it's worth invoking the idea of curiosity, then we really need, I need to use more implicit methods that are less biased by potentially by demand characteristics. And I would argue to make it not trivial research, you really need to sort of test some of the key hypotheses about the nature of information seeking that are out there, and questions like, to what extent is curiosity linearly related to outcome uncertainty as opposed to, you know, showing a U-shaped relationship, something that's been debated. To what extent is it driven by the valence of the information about to be received? To what extent is it important that we use it to increase our current knowledge? The hypothesis has been put forward by some researchers in the States, and so on and so forth. I reckon music, the learning progress hypothesis is one place we can begin to use music. The learning progress hypothesis of curiosity suggests that the brain is motivated to pursue those tasks in which predictions are always improving. So you should stay in a place where you're going to keep improving your model of the world. And in this situation, curiosity is a metacognitive feeling that is there to lead us to the best opportunities for learning and prevent us from being trapped in unlearnable situations, areas, places where we'd be wasting our time. And proponents of this theory suggest that, in fact, when there's enough information to be trying to learn, we will do just that. We will seek information. If, however, there isn't enough information to learn anything, we will stop trying, and we will actually begin to mind wander. And mind wandering can be seen as the antithesis of curiosity, moments where we stop engaging. And it's been shown that people mind wander more when they're not in their region of proximal learning, you know, almost figuring stuff out. And I think some nice avenues could be to do what has been done in the past, which is sort of sample people's experience in real life situations where they are listening to music. And I would argue that in a concert experience where they should be attending, you know, you pay good money to go and, you know, watch a band or an orchestra, you should be attending, and any moments where you're mind wandering is arguably moments where there's nothing, you know, when you're not in your proximal learning zone. And some studies in the past have been able to really tell us a lot about more sort of naturalistic experiences to music through experience sampling and concerts. I would argue learning progress hypothesis already explains everyday music listening phenomena. We tend to reject atonal music, like I said, from the 20th century, partly because these are unlearnable situations often for most listeners who don't, you know, who aren't high in stress tolerance and joyous exploration. So the fact that the bulk of people won't stay around and listen is already suggesting that if you can't learn, you won't really be curious, and we already saw that with our data. But I think, and similarly, if there's really a very formulaic pop song on the radio, you're unlikely to stop and, you know, listen attentively. Again, because there's very little to learn when you've heard it all before. There are, of course, moments when you do pull out your mobile phone and use Shazam. This is the audio identification service. I'm hoping most of you know it, and if you don't, I'll just briefly say what it is. Does anyone know it? No? Okay, so anyway, of course, you turn out, you tap, and then you can identify what the song is. Thanks to, you know, music information retrieval researchers, we can now do this. It tends to receive many queries each day. And Kaneshiro et al. In Stanford, in collaboration with Shazam, actually said, to what extent can we see a relationship between musical events and the timing of Shazam queries. When are people actually curious to know, or let's not use the loaded term curious, but when do they want to know about what this music is and perhaps listen again? So they took quite a few million queries from some topping songs, and showed that, first of all, there's a non-uniform distribution of query offsets, admittedly a lot right at the beginning of the song. They show that this changes over the time life cycle of a song. But I guess the most important thing is that they showed that when salient events happen, like when the vocals start, when the first chorus starts, is when people start reaching for their phone to find out what the track is. And I hope that this sort of it's clear why this might be interesting. I guess where we've been looking at, this was kind of course, it was pop songs, so the most obvious features are beginnings of things, sections. It'd be interesting, I think, to sort of explore a bit more finely what aspects of musical information are also being tracked with using these kinds of data. And so to conclude, why do we listen? I think because sometimes we feel compelled to. The information dynamics of music trigger information seeking states and behavior. And accordingly, ended with a question mark, because this is to sort of not just tell you, but hopefully discuss with you. Perhaps music listening is therefore a promising testbed for exploring how and when humans seek information and the links between information seeking and reward. So thank you, and sorry if I overspoke.
No problem at all. No, that was fantastic. Thanks so much, Diana.